the billion-dollar firewall, and the woman they erased. Before we start, remember the name Grace, because by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why almost no one knows it. A woman spent nearly a decade building something in secret. Not for a company. Not for a client. For herself. A program she worked on alone, on her own time, on her own equipment. Because she'd watched enough people lose jobs in this company to know that no one would come to save her when her job was taken. But she had no assurances as to how effective it could be. And when their company needed it badly enough, she agreed to let them use it, on her terms, with her name on it, under a contract that protected everything she had built. Within weeks, her name was gone. Her files were gone. Her contract meant nothing, and the program she had spent the better part of a decade building was generating licensing revenue for a CEO who had fired her the moment she became inconvenient. This is not a story about a data breach. This is a story about what happens when a corporation decides that the law is just another tool, and that the people who build things worth billions are the easiest part of the equation to erase.
A small but important side note before we're a new channel, and it would help us greatly if you could take a split second to like and subscribe. Now back to the story.
Let's go back to the beginning. Grace was in her early 40s when she started building her code. She was a programmer, experienced, careful, methodical, working at a mid-sized manufacturer of high-tech computer components. She had been there since she graduated college. She knew every corner of that building. She knew every system. She originally thought she would retire there. But in recent years, she had a front row seat to something that quietly terrified her. The company was replacing people. Not loudly. Not all at once. One position here. One restructuring there. But the pattern was clear if you knew what to look for. Employees in their early 50s, people with decades of real-world experience, were being phased out. Their roles were being handed to automated systems, artificial intelligence that was cheaper, faster, and didn't ask for a pension. Grace watched people she had known for years walk out the front door with a box in their hands and a handshake they didn't want. Most of them never found anything close to what they had lost. The job offers that came in paid half what they had made. Some disappeared from her life entirely. Grace was in her early 40s. She had years before the same thing would happen to her. But she had seen enough to know it was coming, so she started building. Not at work. Not on company time. Not on company equipment. On her own laptop. On her own hours. A security program. She built it on older architecture, older logic, the kind of code that modern systems had long since moved past. That wasn't a limitation. That was the design. The newest threats, the most sophisticated attacks, were all built around the assumption that they would face modern defenses. Grace was building something that wouldn't look like a modern defense at all. She kept her laptop in her personal bag. She never connected it to the company network. She had learned not to trust systems she didn't build. Nobody at the company knew what she was working on. Almost nobody. Her coworker Jane knew. Not the details, but enough. They weren't close the way people sometimes assume colleagues must be. But they had shared enough lunches, enough quiet hallway conversations, enough of the same slow-building dread about the direction the company was going, that Jane had pieced together the general shape of what Grace was doing. And Jane had stored that information somewhere in the back of her mind. She would use it later. But first, the breach. It started one summer and escalated fast. The company's networks were taking coordinated hits. Not random background noise. These were surgical, patient attacks. Some of the most sophisticated techniques the industry had ever seen, and they were doing something that the company's security team had never expected. They were feeding the AI's own defensive logic back at itself. It seemed to answer challenges before the AI asked. The system didn't know how to process an attack that looked exactly like its own behavior. Every time it tried to block, the attack adapted. Data was moving out. Systems were stuttering. The security team was working around the clock and losing ground. It seemed AI was being used to corrupt their AI. Think about what that means for a second. The most advanced AI the company had, the same AI that had replaced dozens of human employees because it was supposed to be faster and smarter, couldn't stop people who had simply figured out how to think like it. That's when Jane went to the boss. She told him about Grace. About the old program. About the older logic that modern attackers wouldn't have a playbook for. She framed it as loyalty, as helpfulness, And maybe part of it was. But Jane had also been watching the breach unfold with the particular fear of someone who has no backup plan. Her job was her only income, and if the company collapsed, it collapsed. Grace was called in. She didn't say yes immediately. She had been working on this program for years. It was her retirement, her exit strategy, her insurance against everything she had watched happen to everyone around her. So she made her terms clear. The program would remain her sole property, it would not fall under corporate ownership, it would not be classified as work product. The CEO agreed. He agreed fast. Here's the thing about that. Grace's attorneys would later point out that the CEO's legal team was already in the building the day she agreed to the deal. They had been called before she said yes. Nobody has fully explained how that was possible. Think about what that implies. Grace plugged in her system. Within hours, the attacks stopped. Her old logic hit the attackers like a wall they had no map for. The company's security AI had time to reconfigure. The breach was over. Grace was thanked. There were handshakes. There were words about what a difference she had made. Then the company started building. Grace came back weeks later to recover her laptop. She needed it. Updates to make, improvements to code, a product she still planned to bring to market. But when she opened the device, something was wrong. Her files were there. The surface of the program was intact. But underneath, deep in the architecture, her code had been interlaced with the company's AI model. Not copied, not duplicated, woven together so completely that what remained was neither her program nor their AI. It was something new, something that the security world was already talking about as one of the most effective firewalls ever built. Something worth licensing, something that multiple Fortune 500 companies were already being quietly approached about. The CEO's company name was on all of it, and the day after Grace found out, she was fired. No warning, no conversation. Her access was revoked, her termination paperwork arrived, and she was offered a severance package that her attorneys would later describe as carefully structured to look generous, without coming anywhere near the actual value of what had just been taken from her. She turned it down. Because Grace had done the math. Even a conservative claim, 33% of all future licensing revenue, would be worth more than any one-time payout for a product the industry had already accepted as extremely valuable. She wasn't going to take pennies on the dollar for her work. She wasn't walking away quietly. She was going to fight for what was rightfully hers. Then her friend and coworker Jane disappeared. Not gradually, not the slow kind of quiet where someone stops returning messages. Overnight. Later, she learned that Jane had also been terminated. But Jane's termination came with a different package, the kind that rivals a CEO's compensation. She moved multiple states away, cut every tie, no forwarding address, no goodbye text, no final call. Grace reached out through every contact she had to try to locate Jane, but there was nothing to track. Jane was simply gone without a trace. It was an internal source who eventually told Grace what had happened. Jane had signed an affidavit. In it, she stated that the firewall software was her own work, that she had developed it independently, that she had sold it to the company of her own free will, that Grace had no claim to any of it. Let that sit for a moment. The only person who knew about Grace's program, the person who went to management on Grace's behalf, had become the legal weapon used to erase her, and it was about to get worse. Every record from Grace's years of development, the version logs, the timestamps, the iteration files, had been wiped from her laptop, the one device that held the clearest proof of when her work began and how it had evolved was clean. Not corrupted. Not damaged. Clean. Someone had known exactly where to look. Grace had almost nothing. Almost. Here's where the story takes a turn that nobody planned for. A 13-year-old kid, a self-taught programmer who had already been featured in tech publications for the kind of work that made professional engineers uncomfortable, published a technical breakdown of the new firewall online. He wasn't hired by anyone. He wasn't connected to Grace or the company or the lawsuit. He was just curious about how the thing worked, and what he found when he pulled it apart was specific. The firewall wasn't a single system. It was a fusion. Two distinct logic structures, running in parallel. One modern, built on current AI architecture. One that looked like it had come from a completely different era. written by someone who approached security problems in a way that current engineers simply didn't learn anymore. He couldn't name either architect, but he was certain of one thing: neither layer could have produced the result alone. He published it on a public forum and went back to whatever a 13-year-old does on a Saturday afternoon. Grace's attorneys found it within 48 hours. For a moment, a real, tangible moment, it looked like Grace might have a path. The technical analysis from an unconnected third party, a miner with nothing to gain, but a miner with a mind that was indisputably in the top 11% of programmers in the world. And step by genius step, he described the kind of dual architecture fusion that Grace's own work had been used to create. Most of all, his conclusion could not be questioned. Few had the IQ to dare. His paper wasn't a smoking gun, but it was close enough to matter. That's when the legal machine started moving. The CEO's attorneys filed in civil court. The case was complex. Deliberately so. Questions of software ownership, work product classification, the legal definition of a merger between independently developed programs, jurisdictional technicalities that would take years to untangle. Grace's team filed their claim. The other side filed responses. Motions were made. Continuances were granted. And then the judge issued a gag order. Grace could not discuss the case publicly. She could not speak to journalists. She could not post online. She could not give interviews. Any violation of the order would cost her the right to continue the case entirely. The terms were that specific. That precise. They had got the favor of the right judge. Ask yourself a question. Who benefits from silence? Not Grace. Silence cost Grace everything. Her story, her leverage, her ability to build public pressure around a case that the legal system was in no hurry to resolve. But for the company, silence was worth millions. Every year the case would drag forward was another year the Firewall licensing ran without interruption. And another year the licensing checks would arrive, and Grace would not be a part of the recipients cashing them. The case was structured, and legal observers who reviewed the filings used that word specifically, structured, to ensure that no final resolution would be required for decades. Not 5 years. Not 10. Possibly not in Grace's lifetime. The program is running right now as licenses are already being sold by the thousands every day. Not gradually. Not the slow kind of quiet where someone stops returning messages. Overnight. Somewhere in the infrastructure of companies worth hundreds of billions of dollars, the firewall architecture Grace built is doing exactly what she designed it to do. The CEO claimed both women brought him the software. Jane lied and testified she worked on it during breaks, using company resources, which, as he stated, meant it was company property all along. Jane betrayed Grace and signed the papers and moved on. The CEO now collects all of the licensing revenue. But because Grace refused to sign over her legal ownership claim, she was getting no financial shares, as the legal battle continued to determine who actually owned the software. As the case has now dragged a year. Now every procedural delay could add more years that the company won't have to settle. Years they get to collect more revenue for Grace's work. Every year Grace will get older, and the truth will get harder to prove. That was the company's long game. She built something that could not be broken from the outside. They just found a way to tear her from it, from within. The firewall still works. Usage rights are still being sold, and she still doesn't get paid for any of it. And perhaps, somewhere in the code that protects systems you use every day, there is a layer that belongs to a woman the industry has never heard of, and under the terms currently in place, may never be allowed to. That's how the biggest thefts happen. Not in the dark. Not in server rooms. In conference rooms. With handshakes, with contracts someone else prepared, and with a legal system positioned not to deliver justice, but to delay it until justice no longer changes anything. Remember the name Grace, because the people who took everything from her are counting on you not to.
The YouTube algorithm isn't perfect, and not everyone get the new video alerts. That's why we reach out to all of our priority subscribers directly, so you'll get notified first. The link is in the description below. Thanks for watching.